that. Well, today we're going to talk about another crisis. It's not a food crisis, but a mental, emotional health crisis that's going on in our country. I have a background in mental health before, and while being a pastor, I worked as a chaplain for the fire department locally, and I work with other agencies on crisis response teams through FEMA and Homeland Security. I get deployed when there's a disaster somewhere, and I can go, and to help people that are in crisis. And so today, that's what we're going to talk about. And I'm going to be wearing both hats today. So this won't be a traditional sermon where everything's going to be scripture-based. We're going to give you some tools that you can use today to help somebody that you might know who's in crisis. And whether it's depression, anxiety, stress, sadness, fear, addiction, we just today in our country are ill-equipped to be able to meet the need. And so I believe that this is a great opportunity for the church. And when I refer to a crisis, I'm not necessarily talking about some traumatic event. Someone dies, you go through a divorce, you get a terminal illness, something like that, because a couple of different people can go through an event like that and come out completely different. When a traumatic event becomes a crisis is when you are unable to cope with the aftermath of that. That's when it becomes a crisis. When you can't function on a daily basis, you can't think clearly. This thing begins to rule your life so much that it affects everything about your life. That's when this becomes a crisis. And unfortunately today, a lot of people are in crisis. And so that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to give you some very practical tools that you can use to help somebody who is going through a crisis in their life. If you want to follow along, all the notes will be in YouVersion, the Bible app, and the notes will be in there, also some resources in there as well that will help you. Just look up Vineyard Life Church on YouVersion, and if you have that downloaded, and you'll be able to follow along. Now, like I said, crisis is how an event affects you or someone that you love, or maybe it's a neighbor or coworker or a schoolmate or somebody. People around us are constantly dealing with crisis, and there is this, unfortunately, still a lingering stigma about mental health issues. And because we don't know what to say many times or try to help somebody, sometimes we just end up saying really dumb stuff. And I've put some of my favorites up here. Here's one that we say to people who might be having a mental emotional issue. Well, just stop focusing on the bad things and focus on the good. Just be happy. Come on, be happy. Yeah, I know you got terminal illness, but come on. You know, I know your spouse is abusing you, but be happy. And unfortunately, this isn't the answer, and it doesn't help the person. Happy thoughts aren't going to be enough to fix the situation. A lot of times we have difficulty dealing with other people's emotions, so we just want to keep it happy and light and get them back to normal. Another one, it's all just in your head. Just stop thinking that way. Just don't be depressed. Like somehow the person can control this and turn it on and off with a choice. And I think sometimes what we're doing there is we're trying to minimize their problem because we don't want to deal with it and it's making us uncomfortable. So if you could just fix yourself, it would really help me. You're really kind of annoying me and making me uncomfortable. So if you could go, have your emotional issue over there somewhere. And if you've ever been in that crisis place, you know sometimes who your friends aren't because they get further and further away. And what we need to be as those people that step in closer. Or the Christian version of this. Are you really trusting God? If you just had faith. So now we're going to lay religion on you too and beat you down because you're not spiritual enough, because you can't fix yourself. And because of these simplified answers, because we don't know what else to say and we're uncomfortable, we sometimes do more harm than helping. Are you even trying to get better? And here's what happens in that situation. I'm healthy, so I'm projecting my health on your lack of health. So if it was physical, it would look something like this. Yeah, I see your legs bent to the side and broken, but I've got 2 legs and I can walk. What's wrong with you? Are you even trying to walk? You know? Because we treat mental emotional issues almost as the responsibility of the person who it's affecting more than we would ever put that on somebody with a physical issue. And this is how we have to change our thinking about this. Or you'll hear this question, I think put on there too. Can't they just give you something? Well, yeah, if you can get in with a doctor, and then he'll prescribe something, which will take about at least 3 to 4 weeks to really get into your system to find out if, A, you have the right drug, and number 2, if it's the right dosage. That's why they call it practicing medicine. And they're going to have to practice on you until they get it right. And so after the 3 or 4 weeks, we've got to let all that get out of your system before we tried this one. And it can be months before people really get some type of relief from medication. And unfortunately, in our world of mental health, that's our best solution. And then finally, some people say, well, I would try to get some help, but my insurance just doesn't pay for it, or I can't get in to see somebody. And this is becoming more and more of an issue. The National Institute of Mental Health said that 1 out of 5 people in America deal with a mental health issue. 50 million people. And out of that, less than half are being treated for it. So we have a lot of people walking around that are really messed up. And we used to have, I know we lived in St. Louis, and I know here too, there were psychiatric hospitals. But we don't have those anymore. We have psych units, and we were talking about that. When you're a firefighter or a medic and you've got somebody that you need to take in for a psych evaluation, every hospital's on diversion. They'll come out on the radio. St. Vincent's on diversion, Eskenazi on diversion. That means that they're full and they can't take anybody else. And it's almost a common everyday thing. That if you are in such a place where you have to be transported by an emergency vehicle to a hospital, they can't take you because they're full. That part of their hospital can take no one else. So what do? You take them to hospitals that don't have a good psych unit and just try to help them the best you can. And I know this is somewhat depressing, but there's good news that comes out of this. Currently, I thought this was interesting, 55% of U.S. counties, 55% of all counties in the U.S. do not have one paid behavioral health worker. So even if you want to try to get help, there's either no one available or the line is so long your insurance won't pay for it. So the point is we have a broken system. But I believe we have an incredible opportunity for the church. I believe that the church has the ability to help people that are going through crisis in their lives. In fact, the Bible is full of stories where people intervened and brought God's presence and God's healing ability and God's grace and love and mercy into their lives. And I believe that we need to rise up to that. And what I want to share with you today is nothing that it takes a professional to do. But every one of us can serve people in the way we're going to tell you. Now, I work with first responders a lot as a fire department chaplain. I work with police and EMS workers as well. And in 2017, we crossed a line. And that line was this. Currently, since 2017, more first responders have died from suicide than from line of duty deaths. And what happens is they suffer from this accumulative stress. Because, the bell rings and you get up middle of the night and you go to this run, no matter how traumatic it is, how bad the situation is, could have been a child, could have been somebody that you knew, whatever. You just have to go back in, suck it up, go back to work, lay down again, bell goes off again, and that stress level just rises and rises. And then you get a day off, you come back to work, and it's the same thing again. And so this accumulative stress leads to what we used to think that only military people got, PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress syndrome. And what happens is that stress builds up over time to, at some point, you just can't handle it anymore. You can't cope. 81% of firefighters in a survey said they felt it was a sign of weakness to ask for help. So you've got this huge group of people that are under stress, but they're heroes, and heroes don't get help. Heroes don't admit weakness. So we're trying to remove that stigma more and more and let people know that no, it's healthy. It's a healthy thing is to make the right choice to get some mental health counseling. Sometimes it's not the severity of the trauma, and I think this is in your notes, it's not the severity of the trauma, but the longevity. So a person that's in an abusive relationship for a long time, what changed? What caused them to snap? What caused them to come to the end of their rope? It wasn't that today was any different than this day and that day and that day. It's just all built up, and they became weak to the point of having no hope and realizing this isn't going to change and not being able to cope with the situation that they're in. We see this in natural disasters. The worst natural disaster you can go through, or the one that has the most impact on communities, is a flood. More than tornadoes, hurricanes, floods. And the reason why is because a tornado, next day it's sunny, you can start to rebuild. You can start cleaning up. A flood, you wait, and you wait. And you're experiencing all this trauma while you're waiting and wondering what's going to be left, and knowing that every day water is saturating more stuff and mold is growing and all that kind of thing. And so we have found that in working with people in natural disasters, I've worked with people who have been survivors of fire, forest fires, people who have been survivors of tornadoes, hurricanes. I've worked them all, but it's interesting that flood victims, because of the longevity. And so we see this again with everybody. If somebody is in a financial crisis for a long time, you're caring for a sick loved one for a long period of time. It's not that, again, today's any worse than yesterday. It's just you get to the end of your ability to cope. And now you're in crisis, and you need help. And whether that's you today sitting out there battling your own crisis, or whether it's people around you that are in crisis, we want to help equip you in some real simple ways. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask my friend, Bill Overpeck, to come join me on stage. Bill does everything. He played bass today, and he's also going to help me with this portion. Bill, along with playing the guitar, is also a licensed therapist with Care to Change, which is a Christian-based counseling service here in Avon area. And John Money is also part of that organization. And so I asked Bill to help me, and we're gonna share with you some tools that will help you be able to get other people help as well. So Bill, give us a little bit of your background and why you got into this.
Well, when I was 18, I became a Christian. And at that point in my life, up until that point, I guess I'd been just most like every other teenager, relatively, self-centered. But I began to look around me, and this spiritual awakening also kind of created a recognition that other people are hurting in the world. And so this kind of compassion and care for other people started to cause me to listen more closely to others. And I kind of intuitively understood that listening was a good thing. So after a while, I listened enough that people started seeking me out. I didn't have any real training yet, of course. But that led to me going to college and declaring a major in social work. So it seemed like a kind of a natural calling.
It's good. And you really do have to have kind of a special calling to do this all the time. I couldn't do what John and Bill do. I couldn't counsel people all day. Thankfully, Tana does. And she's developed a team It's difficult for me to sit still that long and listen to somebody. And this is what's key. When you're trying to help a friend, the number one thing, we're going to share with you three things. The number one thing is to listen and try to understand their view. Now, listening is so key. And everybody here has the ability to do it. In fact, you could look as smart as anybody in the room if you just listen well. I think sometimes, though, we're so concerned about what they're saying and how we're going to respond and what are we going to do. And, oh, my goodness, this is terrible what they're going through. What am I going to do to help them? And then our stress goes up, and we're not thinking about them. And all they really do need us to do is to think or to listen and to just listen to what their story is. You know, one of the great skills of listening, I've been working on this, trying more and more, is you listen primarily with your eyes. And just your focus on people and just seeing them and trying to understand what they're doing or what they're going through without judging them. We talk about sympathy versus empathy. Sympathy is when you go, I'm really sorry you're going through that. Too bad. Gosh. I mean, I'm really sad that's happening in your life. And then you walk away. That's why we have sympathy cards. It's kind of a one-time act. But empathy is what people need. Empathy's different. Empathy says, I care so much about what you're going through, I'm going to sit with you in it. I'm going to come alongside you and help you with this. This is what Paul talks about when he says in Romans 15, accept one another then, just as Christ accepted you, in order to bring praise to God. When we accept one another, this is really, really key. Bill, talk about that. You know, somebody comes in your office, I'm throwing you off here, but somebody comes in your office and they tell you this terrible thing. How do you respond to them? Do you respond differently?
Not at all. You do exactly what Tony was describing. You try to imagine what it's like to be in their position, to feel how they're feeling at that moment in time, and kind of acknowledge that you're maybe not going to get quite there, but you can approximate it. But the most important thing that you can do at that point is try to establish trust with that person so that you are just in the moment, being there present with that person. And that's incredibly powerful.
That's true. Paul says in Galatians 2, I love this, he says, love empowers us to fulfill the law of the Anointed One as we carry each other's troubles. Another version says, bear one another's burdens. The point is, Jesus came to abolish the law. He only left two. And he says, one is love God. And the other one, Paul is relating to here in loving people. And one of the ways we love people is we carry their burden. Now, carry their burden doesn't mean you take on their anxiety or you become overwhelmed with their problem. It means that you carry their issue to God, that you help lift them up, that you bring courage to them, you encourage them, you bring them courage. You tell them that there can be something better. And that leads to the second thing that we try to help people with, is guide them away from the pain and toward the future. So whenever somebody's in a crisis, we tend to stay focused in that moment. Have you ever been through that, like you were through an accident or lost somebody or got this terrible news, and you stay in that moment, you can't get away from it. You just keep reliving it over and over and over in your mind. Sometimes it comes out at night in your dreams, or you wake up thinking about it. We talked about that a few weeks ago. And the problem is we get so stuck in that, we can't move forward. And so the only way to move forward is to give people hope. And I think this is one of the problems of when you're limited just traditional mental health counseling. You can try to fix people, but I think what you lack is hope. And Bill, talk about the role that you have as a Christian counselor in providing not only mental health resources, but also biblical resources.
So when I was in school back in the 70s, there were basically three, well, there still kind of are, three schools of thought psychologically, right? There you have the Freudians, and they're kind of weird. And then you've got the behaviorists who have some valuable things to say, but the most popular thing back then was the humanistic psychology, that school of thought. And the humanists basically believe this, that everybody has within themselves everything that they need to solve their own problems. There's no room for anything transcendent. There's no room for God. In fact, God really isn't welcome in that scenario. What we have, though, as Christians, is a whole nother drawer, basically in our toolbox as therapists. And that drawer, in that drawer, there is a set of things like, as Tony said, hope. There's forgiveness, there's grace, there's mercy, there's love, there's self-sacrifice, there's humility. All of these things that don't often get brought into a counseling office in a secular context. So this gives the Christian therapist a huge advantage, because these things are so powerful in the doing of therapy that you simply don't see it in a secular context. So
That's good. It's good. Yeah, you take the area, take Freud, for example. Freudian philosophy is it's not you, it's your parents, or somebody else. So, the big joke is in Freudian means of counseling is, you blame your parents. It's my parents' fault. I go, great, you're healed. You can just dump it on your parents, because there's no way to deal with the blame and the problem. So you have to put it on somebody, or put it on yourself, or try to get rid of it in some way. Whereas in Christianity, what's our view? Jesus took those pains. We've been forgiven. He took all of our shame and guilt and sinfulness and took it on himself on the cross. Therefore, we've been forgiven by God. And because we've been forgiven of everything in our lives, we can now forgive others. See? But unless you get that, unless you can find that core freedom to begin with, that the God who created me loves me, and he's for me, and he's forgiven me. Not only that, but like we mentioned a couple weeks ago, God is there as our creator, as a father that loves us, but he's also there at the end of our lives. So no matter what we go through in life, no matter how bad life is, we still have hope. I often share with people when I have to go to the door to knock on their door late at night and give them that horrible news that someone they love has died. And right before I go to that door, I realize that I'm going to, in a moment, change their entire world. Everything is going to be different after those words come out of my mouth. So I treat it as a very sacred and holy thing and ask God to help me in those situations. But when I sit down with those people and tell them that news, you immediately know whether or not faith is real in their life. Because if they have no faith, this is it. If they just believe that when you're dead, annihilation we call that, if that's it, then there will never be another connection with this person. But if they have hope of a resurrection, then as Paul said, we do not grieve as those who have no hope, because we know that someday we're going to be reunited with that person. See? And this is where hope becomes really important, and we're purveyors of that hope. Now, there's a lot of people say, oh, yeah, Dad's up there drinking with his buddies now, and they're just having a good old time. And really, what are you basing that on? I mean, I don't share that in the moment, but, just basing on what you think is good and ought to happen is not exactly always what God sees it as. Evidence for followers of Jesus. If we don't make that decision to follow him, then we don't have that hope to look forward to. And I can't share that with the average person. I can't say, oh, they're in heaven and you're going to see them again someday. I just have to go strangely quiet and then try to put my mental health hat on and use tools to help them just cope and survive. We want to help people see value in a future. And even if they're not a follower of Jesus, we can still encourage them and help them. You know, sometimes it's not our preaching. It's just our willing to love people. You know, I worked for years with teenagers, and sometimes the bigger, mean facade or visage they put up on the outside, some facade on the outside, and how hard they looked or how they dressed, everything was to repel people. And I realized they've been hurt, and they don't trust people. So they put up this wall and just go, you know, you'll just look at me and turn away that everybody else does, and that will just fulfill what I believe about the world and everybody. But when you press through all of that and you love that person in spite of them rejecting you, when you love them anyway, it makes a profound impact on their lives because you're the exception. Why are you loving me? They're not going to tell you that, but they may be surprised. Why would you care for me in light of what I've done and the way everybody else treats me? And sometimes you may be the only person that presses through that facade to love them. And that can be the breakthrough that they need. Just someone. You say, but I don't like rejection. They may be mad at me. That's okay. You're secure. God loves you. You're secure in Jesus. Paul said, if God's for me, I don't care who's against me.